Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Plains on the Prairie podcast. I'm Max,
And I'm Sam.
and we are back for episode 12. Is
12.
it
Yep.
12 of our Minnesota Aces series? We have an exciting one today. This is Hipolitus T or Tom Biel, who was the son of first generation Polish immigrants, and was born in St. Paul, Minnesota. A fascinating career. Served with the 4th Fighter Group during World War II, which we are very specially in front of recording today. So, without further ado, I think we should hop right into it.
Yeah, let's get started. Glad to have a 4th fighter group ace. We had one back in the North Dakota series with
Mm-hmm.
Oscar Cohen, so it's kind of cool to have another one. We got a Mustang right behind
I
us. So
know.
that's pretty
I
cool.
feel like, for longtime listeners of the podcast, that we originally started out way back in, oh my gosh, 25 years ago now.
2020.
Yep.
Yep.
We started out doing videos like this where Sam and I would be sitting next to one another and recording or talking in front of planes. But we're back and it feels good.
Yeah.
So yeah. So Hippolytus, or throughout the episode, we'll either refer to him as Tom or his nickname of Hippo, which is an awesome nickname,
Yeah.
by the way. Was born on July 28th, 1916 in St. Paul, Minnesota. And like we mentioned, his parents were immigrants from Poland. So I know for certain I've never heard or met anyone named Hipolitus.
Me neither.
I hope I do because that's an awesome
It is
name.
awesome.
But unfortunately, there was not a whole lot available on his early life. I can imagine that growing up, probably I would assume in a Polish speaking household, was especially in, you got to think, St. Paul, Minnesota. I don't know what the Polish population of St. Paul would have been.
Yeah, there's not a huge Polish community here in the upper Midwest. I mean, a lot in Chicago and
Mm-hmm.
stuff. So you never know. I mean, it's St. Paul and Minneapolis at that time were still the hubs that they are
Right,
now of
absolutely.
people. So yeah, it's kind of interesting to know that. And when I was just kind of going line by line on the aces list and figuring out where these people are from and seeing who could be a candidate for these podcasts. And I was like, oh, this guy's not going to be it. If it's probably going to be from Chicago or something like that. If he's Polish, and sure enough, St. Paul.
Wow.
So it's pretty cool. But yeah, he um, entered just like a lot of 4th Fighter Group pilots. Entered the Royal Canadian Air Force on August 5th, 1941, and then entered flight training in December of 1941 up in Canada. From there, he was training most likely on Miles Magisters, Masters, maybe some Harvards at the time, and was promoted to sergeant pilot and awarded his wings on July 24th, 1942. From there, he was deployed to England in August of 42 and began his advanced flying training and operational training, most likely flying Hurricanes at the beginning and then into Spitfires.
Wow. Yeah. See, I think I've been reading a lot of those books you've recommended to me about British pilots who served in Malta during World War II. Yep. So hearing all these terms like operational training unit, reserve training unit, OTUs, RTUs, I feel like I understand now.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, there's so many layers that went into British aviation training, especially in the years leading up. Obviously he joined, when the war had already kind of kicked off, but with some of these other pilots that I've been reading about who were actually born in England or in the UK, a lot of stuff went into making sure that they were properly trained.
Right. And what I found interesting was, about the training is, you did operational training and all that over in England, whereas our guys, the US typically, they did most of their training and then they went right to combat.
Yeah.
So, and you kind of had to have your head on a swivel doing your training in England. I mean, reading, some of those same books I recommended you, never know when someone's going after you and you're in a tiger moth or
Right.
something
Yeah.
like that.
You were always in
anything.
Especially early on, 1941, you were in a combat zone.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So after training with Hurricanes and Spitfires in March of 1943, he was transferred to the United States Army Air Force, where he attended combat crew replacement training from April to September of that same year, flying P-47 Thunderbolts, and then joined the 334th Fighter Squadron of the 4th Fighter Group on September 7th, 1943. So, like we mentioned, a lot of the 4th Fighter Group pilots were originally maybe actually the early ones were at least Eagle Squadron pilots.
All
correct?
three of the Eagle squadrons, and I'm guessing that's where Biel was destined to head to, but it just didn't work out in timing. And by early 1943, a lot of the uh, Eagle Squadron guys went over to U.S. service. Some
Right.
stayed, but most of them
And
transferred over.
I'm thinking here, how fortunate were some of these pilots who got to experience training from both British and American fighter pilots? The British who would have definitely have seen combat against, the Germans either in France in 1940 or during the Blitz. And then, some of these American pilots that would have also served with British units.
It's really interesting. I mean, just with going back to our dead horse we keep beating is the pilot doctrine. How do they train? And the British. I was at Air Corps Aviation last weekend, and just hearing, just learned a lot about the Mustang, like we have behind here. Is just like how the British treated their aircraft. Everything was hand built. The Rolls-Royce Merlin was hand built, whereas the U.S. manufactured a Packard engine. Packard built Merlin, and just the differences in I guess strategy on production and everything like that. It's just really interesting to be able to kind of flip flop between the two. And I'm sure it was an adjustment for people who learned with the RCAF, RAF factions and went over to the US side. And not necessarily the training was worse or better at either, but it was just different.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So while after he had joined the 334th in September of 1943, he scored his first victory against the Luftwaffe in early January of 1944, which was an FW-190 over Cambrai. He downed a Bf-109 and then claimed another as damaged over Hengeli, I believe, on February 10th, 1944. And then it was around that same time period that the unit switched to the B model of the famous P-51 Mustang.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. He's able to kind of dip his toes into multiple aircraft. They were flying the P-47 D model and probably B models at this time, so the really early 47 Razorbacks. And I wonder kind of how the thought process. I mean, the Mustang is a beautiful airplane. I'm curious what.
Yeah.
Just reading about other pilots and how some like the P-47 better versus the 51, just based off of the punishment that it could take. The Mustang was kind of known for once it got hit, it could get bad especially with not having the radial and stuff. So
absolutely.
Coolant leaks. But yeah, after the unit switched to the whole fighter group switched to the B model Mustangs, during the middle of March, Biel damaged a Bf-109 on the 18th, then destroyed a Ju-88 and Me-410 with a ground victory also in there on the 27th of March. So it was a very busy month of ground victories and a shared third victory there.
Wow.
So he found this one site. It's a French website where you can track down all of like the victories from these people. Not everybody, but it was really interesting to be able to just dig through and see, okay, he did this on this day over this place. And it was really interesting.
I was very interested in the fact that he was taking on, Germany's heavy fighters. A lot of the times when you think of German fighters going up against B-17s and Liberators, you think of the Bf-109 and the FW-190. But you have to remember that the Germans had this, I don't know if it was a pre-war doctrine or if it was Goring's idea, but they had heavy fighters, which, Ju-88s, Me-410s, Me-210s, Me-110s, all these aircraft that were basically I feel bad because the Me-410 is one of my favorite German planes of all time. I think it's so cool.
Yeah.
But you got to think, what a waste of resources.
In a way, yeah. I mean,
could you have used those same resources to build how many FW-190s or later on in the war TA-152s?
I mean, you think about just by logic, your two engines burning that much gas. Germany had an oil shortage.
Right.
I mean, just oil itself too in an unrefined state. But yeah, you're looking at that. I mean, the doctrine of the Luftwaffe was at this time pivoting towards intercepting. It wasn't quite an offensive mindset. So you're going after these huge formations of bombers with heavy fighters. I think heavy fighters, high caliber bullets, everything like that, more punishment potentially. But yeah, as soon as the Mustangs came into the scene, it was kind of a change of tide for the air war, where you started being able to escort these planes round trip or get to Berlin and then maybe take a rendezvous with another fighter group. Either way, it was kind of a game changer being able to be right with the heavies. But yeah, and then he achieved his third victory at the end of March on the 29th of 1944. And this was a FW-190 over Gifhorn. And then he claimed a third victory on April 5th, 1944 over Brandenburg. This one being a Ju-88 shared.
Mm-hmm. We should mention 1/3 victory. He claimed it with two other pilots.
Yes, yep, two other pilots. And on that same day, he actually did destroy an HE-111 on the ground near, excuse my German, Weisswarte.
That's
something like that.
Actually sounded pretty good.
There's a lot of German in my family, so.
Again, going back, he was claiming a lot of interesting ground kills.
Yeah.
Ju-88, an Me-410, and an HE-111. That's and then on April 8th, 1944, destroyed a Ju-52.
Yeah.
He's taken out all the big German planes on the ground. Kind of interesting.
Exactly.
So then on April 10th, 1944, he destroyed another unidentified aircraft on the ground at Orleans. I believe I said on April 10th, 1944. And then the following day, shot down Me-410 and a Bf-110 near Stettin, making him an ace. He has to be one of the few aces that we've covered that has scored a majority of his kills against planes bigger than his.
Yeah.
That's really something.
And not all 109s.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of
yeah. I mean, at this time, it's kind of, I mean, you weren't quite to D-Day, so you were, easy striking distance of a lot of these bases in France. Mm-hmm. So you probably saw a lot of these transports and whatnot. So it makes sense.
So my question is, what would because obviously the, German planes weren't bombing London in force as they were, in 1940 and 41. I'm curious what a HE-111 would have been doing that close to the front.
It could have been doing some recon or transport. Some of them, I mean, the HE-111 originally was built as an airliner. It's kind of under the guise that it's an airliner, but
like tractors and tanks.
yeah, same deal. But very interesting. And then his final victory was a ground victory on a Ju-52 at Magdeburg, Hanover, at the air station there. Mm-hmm. That was on April 15th, 1944.
Definitely swinging above his weight class.
Yeah,
for ground victory.
And strafing was no small task. I mean, we wanted to bring these up because strafing is unfortunately how a lot of the U.S. pilots and just a lot of pilots in the war in general got killed. Mm-hmm. I mean, ground fire was very accurate at this point. Like even to go back to the Pacific War a little bit, the Japanese, they had all these different types of calibers of anti-aircraft guns, and they were just getting more accurate as the war came on because they were developing doctrine, because all of their opponents before the U.S. and the Commonwealth forces in the Pacific were the Chinese and people with not a lot of offensive air power.
Right.
So as the U.S. started kind of striking back, and the British started striking back, the Australians, you started to see this ramp up of accurate AA fire. Mm-hmm. And you saw that through the whole European air war too.
Yeah. Well, when we get to the fighter schemes or the surviving warbird schemes part, we have a familiar name who we'll mention, who was brought down by German anti-aircraft fire that we hope that you'll remember.
Right.
But speaking of that, unfortunately, on April 24th, 1944, Biel was shot down over Worms. I know it's Worms. Germany. He was officially listed as MIA and then later upgraded, unfortunately, to killed in action on November 6, 1944, after the war had ended. This was during a huge aerial engagement between 34 FW-190s and BF-109s of JG-11. I believe they actually might know the pilot that shot him down.
Yeah, it was. I couldn't find the official account, or couldn't find anything on who it was exactly, but couldn't get deep enough on the trail. But this was just from a forum I was looking up online, just a World War II aircraft nerd forum that I'm a part of, and there was an engagement account where there was only 3 claimed victories by JG-11 that day, so it probably was one of those 3 pilots. Mm-hmm. And kind of interesting to narrow it down over or to the unit that did shoot him down.
I have noticed that there have been a few instances, at least during my time researching, and this even goes before the podcast era, but they know what pilot shot down, maybe more so B-17s. Mm-hmm. Selfless plug for Joe Bauer's amazing website that I reference quite a bit. He mentions, like, for some B-17s, he knows they know the pilot and the squadron or Jagdstufe, whatever they were called, that shot down this specific plane. I find that absolutely fascinating.
It's really interesting. Just these really, I mean, all these combat accounts. I mean, a lot of them are public view or just in really, detailed
Yeah.
books. Like Anderson last week, we were able to trace down the victory all the way down to the time of day.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And really thankful for everybody who's recovered these, official squadron accounts and all these mission
Absolutely.
reports. It's really cool. So yeah, and then they did recover his aircraft, but there wasn't much left, unfortunately. But yeah, so a very short but very, very dense career.
Absolutely.
At the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So now we will move on to the 334th Fighter Squadron of the 4th Fighter Group. So they were constituted on August 12th, 1942, and officially activated at RAF Bushley Hall in England on September 12th, 1942. They were activated alongside the 335th and the 336th Fighter Squadrons under the 4th Fighter Group, part of, I believe that's 8th Fighter Command. Yep. And then they were moved to the very famous RAF Debden later in September, the Debden Eagles, as I'm aware many of our listeners are familiar with. And the 4th Fighter Group and its squadrons were composed of members of those said Eagle squadrons, initially being equipped with Spitfires, predominantly Mark Vs, maybe a couple of earlier Marks sprinkled in there.
Right. Yeah, and they were kind of throughout their time. We've talked about the Eagle Squadron with Cohen and a little bit with Dunn as well, and they kind of transferred. It started with Buffaloes, Hurricanes, and then Spitfire Mark 1, Spitfire Mark 2s, and then the 5s at the end.
Gotcha. So in April of 1943, the 4th Fighter Group as a whole was then re-equipped with, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, and then they quickly transitioned to P-51 Mustangs in February of 1944. The 4th Fighter Group and its squadrons were part of the first group to escort American bombers over Berlin in March of 1944, so that's kind of a cool little tidbit right there. And they were also the first group to participate in the Russian shuttle missions. So that was where I believe American aircraft that were being ferried to Russia under the Lend-Lease program.
Well, and it was more so the bombing.
Oh, that's right. Yes, that's right.
So we talked about this quite a bit in the Emerson episode, which I know we said we'd plug later, but Emerson was our Christmas special in 2023. And yeah, basically what they would do is bomb targets in Germany, take a stop in Russia for a little bit, take a break, fuel up, and then bomb on the way back to England. Wow. So really cool. Kind of a little tidbit in the European Air War that doesn't get touched on too much.
Up until when we did our Emerson episode, I had never really heard of that. I thought
it's really cool.
Fascinating.
And the 4th Fighter Group was the first one and kind of the main one to do it. So then for the rest of the war, pretty much it was kind of they were tasked with an air support role, doing ground support, escort missions, fighter sweeps, pretty much your run-of-the-mill tasks for any fighter group under the 8th Fighter Command, 9th Fighter Command, just across Europe.
Absolutely. In all, the 334th is credited with 210 aerial victories, and the 4th Fighter Group as a whole, 583. So they were in the thick of it, to say the least. Definitely
they're there all the way from the beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah, honestly, for real. In July of 1945, the 4th Fighter Group was moved to RAF Steeple Morton and returned stateside in November, and was deactivated officially on November 10th, 1945. However, as is the case with many of our World War II fighter squadrons, the Cold War ramped up, and that really put pressure on the U.S. Army Air Force, and then later the U.S. Air Force, to bring back some of these squadrons, primarily as Air Defense Command fighter interceptor squadrons. So the 334th was reactivated in 1946 and moved to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, where they were equipped with F-80 Shooting Stars in 1947. And then they moved to Langley Air Force Base in Virginia in 1949 and were re-equipped with F-86 Sabres. The unit then saw combat in Korea in November of 1950, also flying the F-86 Sabre, where they were credited with astounding 142 aerial victories. I assume most of that was not all MiG-15s, probably a few Yakovlevs and whatnot, that the North Koreans would have been, or North Koreans and Chinese, and possibly even the Russians might have been fielding at that point.
And they saw a lot of time under the 4th Fighter Wing, which is the famous Sabre, wing with where you had the yellow striping and whatnot.
Yellow identification
kind of took a
marks.
different color, but but
Yeah, a little bit.
very, very successsul group of pilots there.
Absolutely. So the 334th remained in Korea until December of 1947 or 57, excuse me, when they were resent to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina, where they are today. There, they started flying the brand new at the time North American F-100 Super Sabre, and then they were re-equipped with the brand new at the time F-105B Thunder Chiefs. I've done a lot of time researching F-105s, and I can always tell, apart from prototype and early A models, almost all F-105Bs started off at Seymour Johnson with the 4th Fighter Wing, whether that was with the 334th, 35th, or 36th Tactical Fighter Squadron, which is pretty cool. In September of 1965, they were now flying F-105Ds and were sent to Tackley Royal Thai Air Force Base, flying missions up north, as they like to refer to it, flying various different route packs to hit targets like Hanoi, Haiphong, stuff like that. Just going through this, it's such a fascinating history.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
we've had some really good luck on these last few episodes.
Absolutely,
it's just a very dense history. So, yeah, and then what I was kind of understanding from the research was the unit was there temporarily, and they were to leave their aircraft behind for the 355th Tactical Fighter Wing. And then pretty much all the personnel heading back to Seymour Johnson.
Yep.
After that, and then they were eventually, or the guise of that was because they were, from my understanding, equipping with the transitioning to the F4s. Right?
Yep, they were one of the first squadrons to receive the new, again at the time, F4E Phantoms. So whereas the C and D models did not have guns built into them, the E models did, right up in the nose. I believe it was the M61 Vulcan, which still is on the F-16 to this day, which is pretty remarkable considering how old of a weapon system that is. And they returned to Southeast Asia in April of 1972, just in time for Operation Linebacker 2, being based at Ubon Air Force Base in Thailand, seeing combat, escorting B-52s, F-111s on, again, strike missions into North Vietnam. Yep. So they returned back to Seymour Johnson in March of 1973. In the 1980s, they were assigned or attached to the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing and assigned to Ramstein Air Force Base in West Germany, taking part in the very famous alert that Ramstein had during the Cold War, which has a really interesting tie-in to Fargo, North Dakota, and the late Major General Daryl Schrader here. But we'll save that for another day. In 1989, they were one of the first, actually, I believe the first operational squadron to field the brand new McDonnell Douglas F-15E Strike Eagles. So, again, I assume most of our listeners know, but the A through D model of the Eagle has always been a fighter interceptor. The E model is basically a bomber, so to speak.
Yeah.
And in my personal opinion, I think the E models have seen the most combat. They got their hands dirty during the Gulf War. I think they shot down, oh gosh, a couple of helicopters.
Yeah,
I heard a story of a Strike Eagle, I believe from Seymour Johnson, that took down a Hind with like a 500-pound JDAM bomb by dropping it right through the fuselage. I would not have wanted to have been on that aircraft when that went through. That would have been horrifying, but probably didn't have to worry about it.
That's some accuracy.
Yeah,
I mean, they did have that technology at the time, but just thinking back, World War II, the Japanese tried dropping phosphorus bombs on U.S. formations, and it never worked.
No,
but just hearing that now, it's just
hoping to burn holes through the fuselage or the aluminum. Yeah. And to this day, the 334th is still part of the 4th Fighter Wing at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina. So really cool that, one of the squadrons, and I know we've talked about the 334th and the 4th Fighter Group in the past, but they embrace their legacy. I know at the time of us recording this, there is currently an F-15E that's flying painted up as a Spitfire, which is pretty cool.
It's really cool.
Still has all the American jet. I think the marking scheme has it just around the time that they would have been into American service, but obviously it's still like a British camouflage. Right. So really, really cool stuff.
It is. Yeah. And the kind of makes me wonder, I mean, if anybody knows this, maybe you do. the kind of curious why in the Cold War they reactivated certain squadrons. Was it because of the storied history, or was it
I think it was
just the
random.
command
I
structure?
think
Yeah.
it was just completely random. I know a lot of, you have to take into account how many bomber squadrons they
Mhm.
had. But even then, some bomber squadrons that flew B-17s and B-24s were converted into either air reserve training squadrons. So they would have been flying C-119s, C-54s. And then, for instance, the 559th Tactical Fighter Squadron, they flew B-17s during the war.
Hmm.
And they ended up flying F4s
Really?
from Cam Ranh Bay
Hmm.
in Vietnam. So,
Interesting.
and now they're a training wing or a training squadron. So
Yeah.
I don't want to say it's random because it might not be, but from my personal experience, what I've been able to track down, I think it was just, hey, what squadrons can
Mhm.
we reactivate?
Yeah.
So,
Well, that's really interesting.
absolutely.
Yeah. So now we'll kind of pivot into our last segment where we're lucky enough to have one behind us,
Yep.
but surviving fourth fighter group airframes and where you can find them. So we found 11. There's probably more. I mean, the main source of this was Mustangs.com.
Great
Known about that
resource.
site for 15 years at least myself. It's actively being updated and just an awesome site to be able to find just airframe history. We're not going to really dive into the airframe history just because there's a lot.
There
Don't want to
is.
keep you guys bored for too long here. So just a few. We found one early model Mustang, a P51C, which is 43 25057, nicknamed Boise B. This was in the markings of Lieutenant Colonel Dwayne Beeson of the 334th Fighter Squadron. He eventually commanded the squadron, and that's on display over in Warhawk Air Museum over in Nampa, Idaho.
So next time we're out there, yeah, I mean, not quite a day trip for us,
no,
but
take a couple days at least, but it's a pretty cool one. They have
absolutely
a really impressive World War II aircraft collection.
I definitely on our list of places to visit sometime in the near future. Another one that we found was P51D-44-13371 or Audrey. It is in the markings of Colonel Chesley Peterson, commanding officer of the 4th Fighter Group. And that one is on display at the Hill Aerospace Museum, just outside of Hill Air Force Base in Ogden, Utah. Again, another air museum that I really want to go to. We did mention their P-47 during our, oh gosh, why am I blanking on his name? The first one of the season or series.
Done.
Yep. They have Glenn Eaglestrom, who was the commander of that fighter squadron or fighter group. Their P-47 is marked up as his because he is a Utah native, turns out. So, yeah.
Yeah. And then one very famous paint scheme is Blondie. So there is one marked up as it is. The airframe number is 44-72777. This is in the markings of Second Lieutenant Marvin Arthur of the 334th. He's another ace. And this one is privately owned in California. A lot of these are privately owned, but you might see them at the racing scene or you might see them at air shows. Some of them are stored, but a good chunk of these are privately owned.
Yeah. Another one is P51D 44-73108. That is Red Dog 8. Red Dog is arguably one of the more famous schemes you'll see for the 4th Fighter Group. That one is in the markings of Major Lewis Norley, commanding officer of the 334th Fighter Squadron of the 4th Fighter Group. And that one is also privately owned in California.
Right. And then we got the rest of these are going to be P51Ds. We have 44-73339, which is nicknamed Comfortably Numb. It's a generic 4th Fighter Group aircraft. And again, this one's privately owned in California.
It's detecting a
California.
Something.
Yeah, I think that's the last of the California.
P51D 73843 Old Red Nose is in the markings of Captain David Howe of the 334th, and that one is owned and operated by the CAF Georgia Wing. Pretty cool.
Yeah, and that one has a good write-up, and maybe we can put that here in the description of the podcast and YouTube adaptation.
Absolutely.
And then we have 44-73877. And this one's I don't believe it was named, but it's in the markings of Colonel Don Blakesley of the 335th Fighter Squadron, who eventually became the CEO of the 4th Fighter Group as a whole. And this is at Biggin Hill in the UK.
Gotcha. P51D 44-74469, aka Red Dog, is in the markings again of Major Lewis Norley, and that one is based out of Arkansas.
Yeah, I believe it's in the Bentonville area.
Oh, cool.
Okay. Yeah, and then another one. This one's out, another one outside of the U.S. It's 44-74494. Getting to be a mouthful. I don't know how you do this all the time. Nicknamed Mustang Sally. This one's another generic fourth fighter group scheme, and it's a privately owned one in South Africa.
Gotcha. And the elephant in the room, or the Mustang in the room, is the one right behind us, and that is P51D 44-74832, aka Boomer. Just generic fourth fighter group markings. It has the iconic boxing eagle that was adorned on fourth fighter group Spitfires and later Mustangs and P47s.
Yeah, and this one actively does fly. What, 5-6 times a year at least.
Much more during the summer.
Yeah, obviously. It's pretty much sits idle in the winter. But if you ever get a chance to get out here to the Fargo Air Museum, it's right here. You can get right up to it. Of course, don't touch it, but but you can get right up there. And this one's been flying since, I believe, 2006, and we are just kind of a matter of lining up schedules. But we have been able to get an interview scheduled with the owner of this, Toby McPherson.
That would be
super nice guy and so knowledgeable.
So. Absolutely. And then one more honorable mention is P51D-44 or 44-74409, aka Donald Duck. And that is in the markings of the 336 Fighter Squadron, 4th Fighter Group. Captain Donald Emerson, who previously we covered on the podcast, he had originally been from up north here in North Dakota and was unfortunately shot down and killed Christmas Day, 1944. So, but yeah, that kind of wraps up our episode. Yeah, thank you guys so much for tuning in. And Sam, anything to add?
Yeah, been a fun one, and we'll come back at it with one next week.
Sounds good. All right, take care, guys.
All right, we'll see you.